You know that old saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes? Well, that rhyme has never been louder than when we talk about incredible, world-changing wealth. We're about to dive into a story that's more than a century old, but honestly, it feels like it could have been written yesterday.
So let's kick things off with something super current. Meta's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, was seen wearing this watch. And yeah, it's worth almost $1 million. Now, while some people talked about the watch itself, for a lot of others, it brought up this echo. An echo of a much older story about what happens when wealth gets this big, and how we, the public, react to it. Because, let's be real, this kind of flashy display of wealth is nothing new. It brings up the exact same question that the richest men in America were forced to answer over 100 years ago. And it's a question that's just as relevant today. What, if anything, do the super rich owe to the rest of society? When people see a tech billionaire with a $900,000 watch, there's a term that always seems to pop up: robber baron. Now, that isn't just a random insult people throw around. It's a very specific historical callback to the original titans of industry from America's first Gilded Age. On one side, you have the faces we all know today: Zuckerberg, Musk, Bezos. And on the other, you have the original empire builders from the late 1800s. We're talking Andrew Carnegie in steel and John D. Rockefeller in oil. And wow, when you look at how they all dominated their markets, the parallels are kind of striking. So where did that name even come from? Well, robber baron actually goes way back to the Middle Ages. It described feudal lords who would just illegally tax anyone passing through their land. So when the Gilded Age came along, people revived that term because they thought it perfectly described guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller, men who were getting unbelievably rich, but at a massive cost to society. And look, you can't deny what these men built. I mean, they forged the steel that built our cities and refined the oil that powered a whole new industrial age. They were, in many ways, the architects of modern America. But, and this is a big but, that progress came at a really steep price. Their playbook was just brutally effective. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, for example, basically controlled the entire oil industry. It would either crush or just buy up any competitor that dared to pop up. They messed with prices, totally ignored worker safety, and used their incredible wealth to make politicians do what they wanted. This wasn't just business as usual, it was like economic warfare. All of this wealth being built up in so few hands was bound to create friction, and boy, did it ever. At one of Andrew Carnegie's steel plants in Homestead, Pennsylvania, a labor dispute exploded into a literal, deadly battle between workers and hired security guards. It was bloody, it was all over the news, and it became this national symbol of the human cost of their empires. It was a moment that's said to have haunted Carnegie for the rest of his life. So you take an event like the Homestead strike, and then you combine it with a new kind of investigative journalism, and you get a perfect storm. The public anger went from a quiet whisper to an absolute roar. And for the very first time, these titans, who seemed totally untouchable, were facing a huge crisis of public opinion. This backlash really built up over time. First, the violence at Homestead just shattered Carnegie's image as a so-called friend of the working man. Then, an incredible journalist named Ida Tarbell came along and just meticulously exposed the ruthless history of Standard Oil. That created a massive public firestorm. It got so bad that by 1905, when Rockefeller tried to donate money to a religious group, a huge debate broke out about whether it was moral to accept his tainted money. This quote from a reformer at the time just nails the public mood perfectly. The crisis they were facing wasn't just about their shady business tactics anymore. It was about the money itself. People started to believe that their fortunes were fundamentally corrupt. So they were being slammed in public, and you have to imagine they were feeling the pressure. They desperately needed a new story. And ironically, it was Andrew Carnegie, the guy whose reputation got so battered by the Homestead strike, who came up with a radical solution. He wrote this famous essay called The Gospel of Wealth, and in it, he basically argued that, look, massive inequality is just an unavoidable part of progress. But, he said, the antidote to that is that the wealthy have a moral duty to act as a trustee for the public and to give away all their extra wealth for the common good. He broke his philosophy down into 3 core ideas, and they were pretty revolutionary for the time. First, he said, stop showing off, live a modest life. Second, think of your extra wealth not as your own, but as a community trust fund that you manage. And third, the biggest bombshell of all, give it all away before you die.
And you know what? He really put his money where his mouth was. Carnegie funded over 2,500 public libraries all across the world. And that's not even counting the universities, the concert halls, the foundations. He built institutions that he called stepping stones to help ambitious people help themselves.
Now, this dramatic pivot from a ruthless industrialist to a world-famous philanthropist, it was completely transformative. But it brings up a huge question that people have been debating ever since, and one that feels incredibly relevant today. So we have to ask, where did this sudden wave of generosity really come from? Was it a genuine crisis of conscience, or was it just a crisis of their public image? Were these guys trying to atone for their sins, or were they just trying to rewrite their own legacies?
And the timing here is absolutely key, because at the exact same time the robber barons were facing all this public anger, a brand new field was being born: public relations. PR basically came into existence to help corporations manage this new, powerful, and sometimes dangerous force of public opinion that journalists had stirred up. I mean, think about it. For decades, these men had operated in almost total secrecy. And then, all of a sudden, they start actively managing their public image. Standard Oil hired its very first publicity expert. The famously private John D. Rockefeller started inviting reporters to his estate for interviews and charming them over games of golf. It was absolutely a calculated strategy to make them seem more human, more transparent. This legacy of strategically giving away money continues today, but it goes by a new name: philanthrocapitalism. It's the whole idea of applying business principles to charitable work, but it faces a lot of the same criticisms. For instance, if a philanthropist invests in a for-profit company that's developing clean water tech, and they get a huge financial return from that, well, it blurs the line between charity and just savvy business. And that brings us full circle, right back to the beginning. We're living in what a lot of people are calling a new Gilded Age. Wealth inequality today has reached levels we haven't seen since the time of Carnegie and Rockefeller. But when you look at the actual data, a pretty startling difference emerges. For all their flaws, and they had many, the Gilded Age titans ultimately gave away the majority of their gigantic fortunes. By contrast, today's wealthiest tech titans, many of whom have even signed a pledge to do the same thing, have so far only given away a tiny fraction of their net worth. Now, there could be reasons for that. People are living longer, maybe they plan to give it away later in life. But the contrast right now is impossible to ignore. It matters because the Gilded Age is like a roadmap. It shows the two faces of extreme wealth: the incredible power to build and innovate, but also the immense social responsibility that comes along with it. And it proves that public opinion, when it gets loud enough, is a powerful force that can, eventually, hold even the wealthiest people accountable. We'll end with this powerful warning from Andrew Carnegie himself. Over a century later, his words still feel like a challenge, not just to the billionaires of our time, but really to all of us, as we decide what kind of legacy we actually value. Is it the fortune you manage to build, or is it what you choose to build with it?